Coral reefs are one of the most beautiful and extraordinary environments in the world. They've remained untouched by human hand for hundreds of thousands of years. This is changing. Sports divers, snorkelers and swimmers can now explore the reefs firsthand. The reefs inspire a sense of wonder. Unfortunately, the effects these tourists are having on the reefs themselves can be disastrous. This reef has been reduced to dead rock in the space of 5 years. The damage is unintentional, but permanent nonetheless. It's also avoidable. Coral reefs are the rainforests of the sea, over 4 million years old and home to a fantastic variety of life. Reefs are built on a scale that dwarfs anything else ever built by animals, including man. They grow in tropical waters, generally favouring eastern coastlines. In Australia, the Great Barrier Reef is over 2,000 kilometres long and in places hundreds of kilometres wide. In the Indian Ocean, the Maldives are made entirely of coral, which has been growing upwards for so long, it's now over 1 kilometre deep. And in Egypt, in the Red Sea, the fossilized ancestors of today's reefs form the cliffs that front the living reef. All this is the responsibility of one tiny animal, the coral polyp. The coral polyp is the essential building block of the reef. It's a relative of the sea anemone and the jellyfish, and it comes in many shapes and sizes. Thousands of polyps grow together in colonies to form each coral outcrop. Each polyp works with little plants or algae inside its body to extract salts from the sea and build itself a limestone casing to live in. They normally feed at night by extending their stinging tentacles to grope for food. Usually they hide inside their limestone casing, and that's all that's visible. Each one of these circular nodules is home to a polyp. Corals reproduce by either spawning or budding from the parent. As each polyp dies, it's replaced by others growing on top. The surface of any reef is covered by hard and soft living coral, sponges, algae, and dead coral rock. Healthy reefs are almost totally covered by a carpet of living coral. Reefs grow very slowly. This pillar coral, for instance, grows about 1 centimetre a year, which makes this colony about 750 years old. Reefs need plenty of oxygen, sunlight, and constant tropical heat. The reef is a climax system, very old, highly developed, and in balance with itself. On first sight, life looks chaotic, but behind the chaos, there are complex patterns which enable so many to live in the same space. Each fish occupies its own particular niche in the food chain. One fish reaps a particular crop, while its neighbor eats another. They work daytime and nighttime shifts to avoid competitors and predators. And yet, despite this wealth of life, reefs grow in seas which are poor in food. That's why the water is so clear. Marine life recycles nutrients up and down the food chain so efficiently that virtually nothing goes to waste. Reef creatures depend on each other for their survival. For instance, the clownfish seeks protection from its predators by living in a sea anemone cluster, but avoids the anemone's stings by covering itself with mucus. In return for the anemone's protection, the clownfish eats its food wastes. The cleaner wrasse feeds on other fish's parasites. Larger fish, like this batfish, come to their cleaning stations to be cleaned. The batfish allows the wrasse access to its skin and gills, which it cleans. On the reef, because animals and plants are so dependent on each other, when one group is disrupted, other groups are affected. The coral itself sits at the bottom of almost every food chain. So when it's disrupted, the potential for damage is enormous. The growth in dive tourism is putting stress on the reef. These divers in the Red Sea are typical of dive tourists. Their careless diving and snorkeling damages the living skin of the reef.
I'm absolutely convinced that the vast majority of diver damage is due to ignorance. The vast majority of contacts underwater are voluntary in the sense that people sit down on the reef or kneel down on sand, and they have no idea what the consequences are.
Most damage is caused by contacts with the reef. Divers bump into the coral or kick it accidentally with their fins. Their depth and pressure gauges drag along the coral beneath them, and divers touch the reef with their hands, either to steady themselves in a current or to stay in one place. Living coral secretes a mucus slime which protects it from infection. Break this coating, and bacteria can enter and kill the whole colony. You can see the mucus on this diver's fin. On average, divers touch the reef 8 times in every dive. They kneel down on sand, often for training sessions, and stir it up when they leave. Sand clouds descend on the coral and suffocate the polyps. Collisions with the reef are greatly increased when divers haven't mastered their buoyancy control. Neutral buoyancy enables divers to float freely at any depth. If they're always finning just to stay in the same place, something's going to be damaged. A staghorn coral broken by divers. Each finger takes years to regrow.
I would say the most common form of damage is that caused by photographers, because they pay no attention to where their limbs go. They pay no attention to where the hoses go. They just want to get the right shot. So very often you see them literally lying on the reef, focusing this little clownfish, whatever it might be. Very, very, very few photographers have the buoyancy control needed to take photographs.
Reef creatures are generally curious, and divers play with fish and even chase them. Sometimes divers feed fish, but by introducing unusual foods to the reef, an established balance is disrupted. If fish become accustomed to being fed, it alters their feeding habits, affecting other creatures up and down the food chain.
It was somebody that went around with a ping pong ball because he knew that fish feeding is prohibited. So there was a huge Napoleon, and what he tried to do is that he tried to tease the Napoleon fish with his ping pong ball, and this huge monster went for him. And one of the things about fish feeding is that not only does it interfere with the feeding chain, but it also changes, it makes fish more aggressive, no doubt. The Australians have done a lot of research on this.
Many reefs are being slowly covered in diver rubbish. Plastic will not biodegrade and suffocates anything it lands on. Divers and snorkelers making shore dives stand on the coral and walk on it to get to and from the reef. A decade ago, this reef flat was covered in live coral. Now it's a desert. The living part of the reef is essentially a two-dimensional skin. Break this skin, and all that's left underneath is dead limestone. Snorkelers and scuba divers are the new animal on the reef. Like any animal, they have to find their place in the system. Sadly, on some dive sites, they haven't fitted in very well at all. This dive site is virtually dead. Five years ago, this graveyard would have looked like this. It's not so much that individual divers cause a lot of damage, but the cumulative effect of lots of them can. In 1993, 120,000 divers and snorkelers came here to the Red Sea. 180,000 visited the Maldives, 250,000 the Cayman Islands.
The experiment to quantify diver damage is based on a before and after situation. So what you get is that I observe divers and quantify the damage for about 3 dives. Then there follows a briefing, an ecological briefing, a detailed one, and then I look at them again for the remaining 7 dives. And what we've seen is that following the ecological briefing, there is a major drop in the amount of impacts. When I say impacts, I mean the number of times the 6 guinea pigs I'm using have actually touched the reef, either with their hands, their fins, their body, their gear. And the drop that we've noticed is that if the average number of impacts per dive before the briefing is about 8, after the briefing it drops to anywhere between 1 and 1.5.